Some people don't realize they're lonely until a stranger's voice becomes the only part of the night that feels warm. Elias Brooks thought that somewhere around 11:40 p.m., while waiting at a red light beneath the glow of a flickering pharmacy sign in Midtown Manhattan, rain tapped softly against the windshield of his black Toyota Highlander, steady and patient, the kind of rain that made the city feel quieter than it really was. The heater hummed low near his knees. Somewhere behind him, the faint scent of lavender and cold night air lingered in the back seat from his previous passenger. His dashboard clock blinked tired red numbers. Another long night. Another 12-hour shift. Another evening spent chasing surge pricing instead of sleep. He rubbed one hand across his jaw and glanced at the photo clipped beside the navigation screen. His son, Isaiah, grinning wide in a faded Brooklyn Nets hoodie, missing one front tooth. 8 years old. Science fair tomorrow morning. Elias promised he'd be there before school started, even if it meant surviving on coffee and stubbornness again. The phone mounted beside the steering will chime softly. New ride request. Upper East Side pickup. 5-star passenger. He accepted automatically. The city blurred around him as he crossed town, headlights stretching across rain-slick pavement like ribbons of melted gold. By the time he pulled in front of the address, the doorman was already holding an umbrella over a woman stepping carefully onto the curb. White coat, black heels, hair pinned loosely like she'd stopped caring halfway through the night. She moved with the posture of someone used to being watched, but tonight there was no performance left in her. Even from behind the wheel, Elias noticed the exhaustion in the way she exhaled before opening the back door. "Good evening," he said gently. "Claire." She gave a small nod without really looking at him and slid into the back seat. The door closed softly. Warm air folded around her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elias adjusted the mirror slightly, enough to confirm she was staring out the rain-covered window with the distant expression of someone mentally standing somewhere else entirely. Manhattan drifted around them in reflections and silence. He'd driven enough night shifts to recognize certain kinds of quiet. Angry quiet, drunk quiet, heartbroken quiet. Hers felt heavier than all three. He pulled away from the curb carefully. "Would you like some music?" he asked after a minute. Voice calm and low, the same voice teachers use in hospital waiting rooms or fathers use during thunderstorms. The woman finally looked up. Their eyes met briefly through the rearview mirror. Something in her expression changed so suddenly it almost made him glance back twice. Not fear, not surprise exactly. Recognition. Her lips parted slightly as if the air had left her lungs too fast. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere downtown before fading into the rain. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. "No." Her fingers tightened slowly around the leather strap of her purse. "I just want to hear your voice again." Elias felt the steering wheel steady beneath his palms while his heartbeat missed one quiet step. Because people said strange things in rideshares all the time. Drunk things, sad things, lonely things. But the way she said again made the entire car suddenly feel smaller, more personal, like he had stepped into the middle of a conversation he didn't remember starting. Claire Whitmore had spent the last 4 months pretending she was functioning normally. That was the terrifying part, not the panic attacks hidden behind conference room doors, not the sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of a $30 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, not even the silence that waited for her every evening after the headlines faded and the investors stopped calling. It was the fact that nobody noticed, because Claire had become very good at performing stability. She knew how to smile during interviews, how to thank board members, how to stand beneath bright lights wearing white silk and diamonds while feeling absolutely nothing inside her chest. Earlier that evening, she had attended another charity gala downtown. Another ballroom filled with crystal glasses, expensive perfume, and conversations that sounded rehearsed before they even began. Men asking about market projections. Women complimenting dresses they secretly hated. Everyone watching everyone. Nobody listening. Claire lasted 93 minutes before slipping out through a side exit near the hotel kitchen because she suddenly could not breathe beneath all the polished noise. The rain outside had felt colder than expected. Honest, at least. Her assistant offered to call security. Claire lied and said she wanted fresh air. What she really wanted was 5 minutes where nobody needed anything from her. She walked half a block alone before opening the rideshare app with trembling fingers. The moment his voice reached her through the front seat, something inside her stopped moving. It was impossible, and yet not impossible at all. 3 months ago, on a Thursday night she never spoke about, Claire had sat alone on the floor of her penthouse kitchen wearing sweatpants and staring at a bottle of sleeping pills beside the sink. Her mother had died 8 months earlier. The man she nearly married had quietly left 2 weeks after the funeral. The company's stock was falling. News outlets were circling her like wolves waiting for weakness. That night the apartment had felt so silent she could hear the refrigerator humming from 2 rooms away. She remembered gripping her phone so tightly her fingers cramped while scrolling through numbers she never intended to call. Therapist, assistant, investor relations. None of them felt possible at 2 in the morning. Then she found a crisis support hotline buried between search results. 24 hours. She almost hung up after the first ring, but then a calm voice answered. "Thank you for calling tonight. My name is Elias. I am here with you." She still remembered the exact way he said with you instead of for you. Small difference. Huge feeling. He never rushed her, never sounded frightened by her silence. While rain struck the windows behind her, he spoke softly about ordinary things. How New York looked after midnight. How people carried invisible weight every day. How surviving one difficult night was still surviving. At some point she admitted she had not slept properly in weeks. He told her to open a window and listen to the city breathe for a minute. So she did. By the end of the call, she was crying quietly into the sleeve of her sweatshirt while his voice remained steady on the other end of the line, like someone holding a flashlight inside a dark tunnel. She never learned his last name, never saw his face, but she remembered the sound of safety. And now somehow, against all logic, it was sitting 3 feet away from her behind the steering wheel of a black SUV moving through rain-soaked Manhattan. The city moved around them in blurred reflections and red brake lights, while neither of them spoke for almost 3 full blocks. Elias kept both hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward, posture relaxed the way years of driving had trained him to be. But inside, curiosity pressed quietly against his ribs. He knew that voice now. Not her face, not her name. The voice. Softer tonight, more fragile than before. Still carrying the same exhaustion he remembered from those overnight hotline shifts he used to work twice a week downtown. He had started taking those calls after his wife passed away 3 years earlier. Grief had left his apartment painfully silent after Isaiah fell asleep each night, and the extra money helped cover rent, school lunches, and the asthma medication his son needed during winter. At first, he only stayed for the paycheck. Then one night, a stranger told him, through tears, that hearing another human being breathe on the line kept her from doing something irreversible. After that, Elias never treated the work like just another job again. He glanced briefly at the rearview mirror. Claire sat angled toward the rain-covered window, one hand resting against her temple, the city lights sliding across her face in soft streaks of gold and blue. Without the cameras and polished suits, she looked younger somehow, not weaker, just tired in a real human way. The kind of tired sleep could not fix. "Long night?" he asked gently. Her eyes shifted toward the mirror again. For a second, something almost like embarrassment crossed her face. "Long year," she answered quietly. Elias nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "Those happen." The corners of her mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel different from the silence before. Outside, steam rose from a subway grate as pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas along Lexington Avenue. Somewhere nearby, a saxophone player filled the wet air with slow jazz drifting up from the sidewalk. New York always sounded lonelier after midnight. Claire closed her eyes briefly against the headrest. "You still do it?" she asked. Elias frowned softly. "Do what?" "Answer calls." The question settled into the car like another passenger. He looked at the mirror again, this time longer. Sometimes, he admitted carefully, Not as much lately. Claire stared down at her hands. You probably do not remember mine. Elias thought about that. Thousands of voices over the years. Panic attacks. Divorce papers. Hospital rooms. Veterans. Teenagers. Widowers. People sitting in parked cars because they could not bear going inside empty homes. But every once in a while there were calls that stayed with him after the shift ended. Calls where the silence sounded heavier than the words. He remembered one woman who apologized 3 separate times for crying. One woman who kept saying she was tired of being needed by everyone. One woman who whispered thank you like she was surprised kindness still existed. I remember more people than you would think, he said honestly. Claire looked away quickly after that, blinking hard once toward the rain outside. Elias pretended not to notice. Good drivers understood something important about strangers. Sometimes dignity meant giving people privacy inside their sadness. The navigation screen announced the next turn in a soft, automated voice. 23 minutes remaining. Elias lowered the volume. Can I ask you something? Claire said after a while. Sure. Her fingers traced slowly across the seam of her coat sleeve. How do you stay calm all the time? Elias let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Who says I am calm? Your voice does. He did not answer immediately. The traffic light ahead turned red, bathing the inside of the SUV in warm crimson. Elias finally spoke without looking back. Maybe some people learn to speak softly because life already yelled at them enough. Claire swallowed hard at that, and for the first time all night, the silence between them no longer felt empty. By the time they reached the Queensboro Bridge, the rain had softened into a fine silver mist drifting across the East River like smoke. Manhattan glowed behind them in blurred towers of white and gold, beautiful from a distance, almost gentle. Claire watched the skyline through the fogged window beside her and wondered when exactly the city had stopped feeling like home. Maybe after her mother died. Maybe long before that. Success changed the shape of loneliness in strange ways. At 36 years old, Claire Whitmore had 3 penthouses, 2 vacation homes, and a company worth more money than she could emotionally comprehend anymore. Yet the person she spoke to most often these days was an assistant paid to organize her calendar. The realization sat quietly inside her chest while the SUV moved steadily through the wet midnight streets. Elias adjusted the heater slightly warmer without mentioning it. Claire noticed anyway. Small things. He seemed to understand people through small things. Do you ever get tired of driving? She asked after a while. Elias smiled faintly to himself. Honestly. Sometimes I get tired before I get tired of it. She looked toward the mirror again. What is the difference? Driving pays bills, he said. People pay attention to the hard part of life. Keeping food on the table. Rent. Work. But being tired in your spirit. He shook his head once. That sneaks up on you. Claire lowered her gaze slowly after that. Because somehow a man driving night shifts in an 8-year-old SUV kept describing emotions her own therapist had spent months circling with expensive vocabulary. The traffic thinned as they moved deeper into Queens. Corner delis glowed quietly beneath buzzing neon signs. Laundromats still hummed behind fogged windows. Somewhere outside, 2 teenagers laughed beneath one umbrella while crossing the street. Ordinary life. Claire had spent so long surrounded by curated perfection that normal moments almost startled her now. Elias stopped at another red light. He glanced briefly at the gas gauge and mentally calculated whether he could finish the shift before refueling. Isaiah would need $20 Friday for the field trip to the Museum of Natural History. Rent was due in 6 days. The check engine light had flickered twice earlier that week. Life kept arriving in small invoices. But tonight, strangely, the weight of it all felt lighter inside this quiet car. Claire rested her head carefully against the seat behind her. Can I tell you something embarrassing? She asked softly. Elias shrugged lightly. You could tell me anything. I'm probably never going to judge you for it. That almost made her smile again. Almost. She stared out at the wet streets passing by. After our call that night, she admitted quietly, I started leaving the television on before bed. Elias listened without interrupting. Not because I wanted to watch anything, I just could not stand the silence anymore. Her voice thinned slightly near the end of the sentence. Silence can get loud, Elias said gently. Claire closed her eyes for a moment because nobody had ever answered her that way before. No lecture. No inspiración el quote. Just understanding. The kind that did not ask for attention afterward. The navigation announced they were approaching her destination. 30 Park Crescent, one of the most expensive residential towers in Manhattan. Elias glanced at the address, then back at the mirror, realization finally settling into place. Claire noticed the exact second he understood she was wealthy, powerful, important. Most people changed after that moment. Their tone sharpened, their posture straightened. Some became overly polite, others suddenly nervous. But Elias only nodded once to himself and kept driving exactly the same way he had before. Somehow, that affected her more than anything else all night. The black SUV rolled beneath the covered entrance of 30 Park Crescent at 12:27 a.m. Rainwater shimmered across the polished stone driveway, while two uniformed doormen hurried beneath gold-trimmed awnings. Umbrellas already opened before the vehicle fully stopped. The building rose into the clouds above them, all glass. In silence, and old money pretending not to show off. Elias had driven wealthy passengers before. Hedge fund managers, surgeons, athletes, people who treated Manhattan like their private living room. But something about this place felt colder than the others. Maybe because it was too perfect. Claire did not move right away after the car stopped. She remained seated in the back with her hands folded loosely in her lap, staring through the rain-speckled window at the towering entrance ahead. One of the doormen stepped toward the SUV, then paused after recognizing her silhouette inside. His posture straightened instantly, respect mixed with fear. Elias noticed that too. "Home sweet home?" he asked gently. Claire let out a quiet breath that carried no humor inside it. Something like that. The doorman opened her door carefully. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." Elias caught the subtle shift immediately. Whitmore, as in Whitmore Technologies. The same Whitmore whose face appeared on financial magazines beside headlines about billion-dollar mergers and artificial intelligence contracts. Claire Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer. Youngest woman ever listed among the top 10 most influential executives in New York finance. Elias blinked once in quiet surprise before smoothing the reaction away. He had expected successful, maybe wealthy, but not that wealthy, not famous wealthy. Claire stepped halfway out of the vehicle, then paused after noticing he had gone still. Most men changed around her once they realized who she was. Some became overly charming, others uncomfortable, a few resentful. Money exposed insecurities the same way bright light exposed dust. But Elias only leaned back slightly against the seat and said, calm as before, "Well, now I understand why your assistant sounded stressed in the background that night." Claire stared at him for one surprised second before a real laugh escaped her throat. Soft, quick, honest. It vanished almost immediately, but the sound lingered warmly inside the SUV after months of never being used. Even the doorman looked startled. "That bad?" she asked quietly. "Sounded like 3 people were having heart attacks at once," Elias replied. Claire shook her head once, lowering her eyes. That was probably accurate. Another silence settled between them, but this one carried less weight than before. Outside, traffic hissed softly across wet pavement while steam drifted upward near the curb. Somewhere down the block, a taxi horn echoed briefly into the night. Ordinary city sounds, yet neither of them seemed eager for the ride to end. Claire rested one hand lightly against the open door. "You know," she said carefully, "most people get nervous around me after they find out who I am." Elias shrugged faintly. "Should I?" Her eyes lifted toward his through the dim interior light. "Usually," he considered that for a moment. "You still seem like the same tired woman from 20 minutes ago." The words were simple, not cruel, not flattering, just true. Claire looked at him as if nobody had spoken honestly to her in a very long time. Maybe nobody had. The doorman shifted awkwardly nearby, uncertain whether to wait or disappear. Elias glanced toward the dashboard clock. Isaiah would already be asleep by now, at his mother-in-law's apartment in Brooklyn. Tomorrow morning the boy would probably ask if he missed another bedtime story. Guilt pressed softly against Elias's chest the way it always did after late shifts. Claire noticed his expression change slightly. "You should probably get home," she said. "Your son has school tomorrow." Elias looked back at her, surprised. "You remembered that?" Claire gave a tired little nod. "You said science fair." He smiled then. Small, genuine, the kind of smile worn by people who almost forgot they still knew how. And for one strange, quiet second beneath the glowing lights of the richest building on the block, Claire Whitmore suddenly did not feel powerful at all. She just felt seen. Claire should have stepped out of the SUV then. Any reasonable person would have. The doorman was waiting. The lobby lights glowed warm behind glass walls 30 feet high. Upstairs, an entire penthouse sat untouched exactly the way she left it that morning, spotless and silent and empty enough to hear her own breathing echo after midnight. But the thought of walking back into that apartment suddenly filled her with a strange, quiet dread. Elias reached toward the screen to end the ride, but before his finger touched it, Claire spoke softly from the open door. "Could you keep driving?" The question lingered between them beneath the rain and city noise. Elias turned slightly in his seat. "You sure?" Claire glanced toward the tower behind her, expression unreadable for a moment. "I just cannot go upstairs yet." Something in the honesty of her voice made him pause. No performance, no polished executive tone, just exhaustion. The kind people carried when they had spent too long pretending to be fine. Elias looked once at the clock again. 12:32. If he left now, he could still sleep 4 hours before Isaiah woke him for school. Responsible choice. Practical choice. But practicality had never been the thing that made him stay on hotline calls past the end of his shift. Sometimes people needed presence more than solutions. He tapped the navigation screen off and pulled gently away from the curb. The doorman stepped back in confusion as the SUV disappeared into the wet Manhattan streets again. Claire settled quietly into the back seat while the city unfolded around them in silver reflections and traffic lights bleeding through rain. For several blocks, neither spoke. Elias drove south toward the Brooklyn Bridge without really deciding to. New York looked different after midnight. Softer somehow, less interested in impressing anyone. Construction crews worked beneath floodlights. Street vendors packed away carts. Apartment windows glowed above dark sidewalks like tiny floating lives stacked together in the sky. "Do you ever go home and just sit in your car for a while?" Claire asked suddenly. Elias smiled faintly. "Couple times a week." "Why?" "Because inside somebody always needs something." The answer hit her harder than she expected. Claire looked down at her hands. "That sounds terrible." "No," Elias said gently. "It sounds like being needed." The SUV rolled onto the bridge, while dark water moved beneath them like silk. Manhattan shimmered behind their shoulders now, beautiful and distant. Claire stared out the window and finally spoke to things sitting quietly inside her chest all evening. "I do not think anyone actually knows me anymore." Elias listened. "They know the company," she continued softly. "The interviews, the headlines. The version of me that knows what she is doing all the time." Her voice thinned slightly. "But every room I walk into feels like a performance now." Elias nodded once. "That gets heavy." Claire laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor inside it. "You know what the strange part is?" "What?" "The more successful I became, the less honest people got around me." Rain slid slowly across the windows beside her. "Everyone wants something. Approval, access, money, favors. Nobody talks to me normally anymore." Elias rested one arm loosely against the steering wheel. "Sounds lonely." Claire swallowed hard, because that was exactly the word she had spent 2 years avoiding. Lonely sounded weak, temporary, small, but hearing someone else say it aloud made the truth impossible to ignore. The bridge lights drifted across Elias's face in soft flashes while he drove calmly through the night. No judgment. No fascination with her wealth. No awkward curiosity. Just quiet understanding. Claire leaned her head carefully against the cool glass beside her and closed her eyes for a second. "Do you know why I kept thinking about your voice after that call?" she asked. Elias glanced toward the mirror. Why? Her answer came barely above a whisper. Because you sounded like someone who would stay. The words settled softly inside the SUV, but Elias felt them anyway. Because people rarely admitted what they truly feared unless exhaustion finally loosened the lock on their pride. Outside, Brooklyn drifted past in blurred storefronts and glowing apartment windows, while rain whispered steadily against the roof. Elias kept driving without rushing her answer away. Most people leave eventually, Claire said quietly after a moment, almost like she regretted speaking at all. Especially when things stop being easy. Elias rested his hand loosely against the steering wheel. That sounds personal. Claire let out a breath that almost turned into a laugh. Everything becomes personal when enough people disappoint you. The city light shifted across her face again as they passed beneath an overpass. Without the makeup from earlier in the evening, the dark circles beneath her eyes looked deeper now. Human. Real. Elias had seen that look before. Nurses after double shifts. Widowers in grocery store parking lots. Parents pretending not to cry in hospital elevators. The face of someone carrying too much for too long. Can I tell you something you probably will not like? He asked gently. Claire opened her eyes slowly against the window. Sure. I think you got too good at surviving. She stared toward the mirror, surprised by the sentence. Elias shrugged lightly before continuing. Some people survive things for so long they forget they are allowed to rest afterward. Claire looked away quickly after that. The lump rising in her throat caught her off guard, so suddenly she pressed 2 fingers against her lips for a second. Nobody in her world spoke that plainly anymore. Executives analyzed. Therapists guided. Investors negotiated. But Elias simply noticed things. Quietly. Accurately. The SUV rolled through a sleepy neighborhood in Brooklyn Heights where brownstone windows glowed soft yellow against the wet, dark streets. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes moved gently from a fire escape. Do you know what the worst part about losing my mother was? Claire asked finally. Elias shook his head once. Everyone expected me to recover quickly because I kept working. Her voice grew thinner with each sentence. I gave a presentation 3 days after the funeral. Forbes called me resilient. She laughed softly then, but tears had already begun collecting silently in her eyes. I remember standing backstage afterward thinking, if I disappeared right there in front of everyone, they would probably still ask for the quarterly numbers. Elias listened without interrupting. That was the thing Claire noticed most about him. He never rushed pain away because it made him uncomfortable. He just stayed present beside it. You do not have to perform in this car, he said quietly. The sentence broke something open inside her. Claire turned her face toward the rain-covered window before the first tear slipped free, embarrassed by how quickly it happened. But once it started, the exhaustion behind it followed. Months of pressure, silence, loneliness, grief carefully folded beneath designer jackets and magazine covers. She covered her eyes briefly with one hand while trying unsuccessfully to steady her breathing. Elias lowered the music volume, even though nothing had been playing at all. He simply made the silence softer around her. Claire cried quietly in the back seat, while New York moved outside like a distant dream neither of them needed to explain. No dramatic collapse. No speech. Just the sound of someone finally getting tired of pretending they were unbreakable. Elias kept driving slowly through the sleeping city, giving her dignity inside the moment instead of staring at it. After several minutes, Claire wiped carefully beneath her eyes and whispered without looking up, I am sorry. Elias frowned softly. For what? Falling apart in your car. A faint smile touched his face. Claire, he said gently, falling apart is not the same thing as failing. The words settled into the silence between them like warmth. And for the first time in almost a year, Claire Whitmore stopped feeling like a problem that needed to be managed. By the time Elias finally turned the SUV back toward Manhattan, the rain had almost stopped. The streets glistened beneath streetlights like wet black glass, and the city had settled into that rare hour where even New York seemed to breathe slower. Claire sat quietly in the back seat now, one arm resting near the window, her expression softer than before. Not fixed, not magically healed, just less guarded. Elias understood the difference. Some nights people did not need answers. They just needed somewhere safe enough to stop holding everything up alone. The heater hummed softly near the floorboards while the windshield wipers moved in slow, steady rhythm across the glass. "Thank you," Claire said suddenly, voice still rough from crying. Elias glanced briefly toward the mirror. "You already said that on the phone 3 months ago." Her eyes widened slightly. "You remember that part?" "You sounded." Surprised kindness still existed. Claire looked down with a faint shake of her head. "That sounds dramatic." "Sounded honest." The SUV rolled to another stoplight near Soho. A cyclist crossed slowly in front of them beneath glowing traffic signals, while steam curled upward from subway grates nearby. Claire watched the city through tired eyes and realized something strange. For the first time in months, she was not thinking about tomorrow. Not the board meeting. Not the stockholders. Not the interviews waiting at 9 in the morning. Just this quiet drive through rain and light and the calm voice in the front seat. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. "Sure. Why are you still driving rideshare if you already work another job?" Elias smiled faintly to himself. "Because asthma medication costs more than common sense." Claire blinked, caught off guard before he added gently, "My son is okay. Just expensive lungs." She laughed quietly despite herself. The sound filled the SUV warmer this time. "How old is he again?" 8. Thinks dinosaurs should still exist, and broccoli is government punishment. Claire shook her head with a small smile, still lingering near her mouth. "He sounds honest." Painfully. They drove another few blocks before Elias noticed something glowing faintly on the passenger seat beside him. A folded piece of paper with silver stars drawn across it in blue marker. Isaiah's science fair project notes. He had completely forgotten they were there. Claire leaned forward slightly from the back seat. "What is that?" Elias picked it up carefully at a red light. "My son's project." His expression softened immediately. "He wants to build a model rocket tomorrow." Claire looked at the paper in his hands, covered in crooked handwriting and marker drawings. Something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly at the sight. Such a small, ordinary thing. A tired father working night shifts while helping his son build paper rockets. The simplicity of it felt almost foreign to her world now. "You really love being his dad, do not you?" she asked softly. Elias looked genuinely confused by the question at first. More than anything. The answer came so quickly, so naturally. Claire turned toward the rain-dark window afterward because emotion moved through her again without warning. Not sadness this time exactly. Grief, maybe, for all the warm success never managed to buy her. They finally pulled back beneath the glowing entrance of 30 Park Crescent, close to 1:30 in the morning. This time Claire did not open the door immediately. She reached slowly into her purse instead and removed a slim white business card embossed with silver lettering. Whitmore Technologies, Chief Executive Office. She held it toward the front carefully. "I know this is probably strange," she said quietly, "but would you consider driving for me privately sometimes?" Elias glanced back at her, surprised. Claire lowered her eyes briefly before continuing. "Not because I need security or status. Her fingers tightened slightly around the card. "I sleep better after hearing your voice." Silence settled gently between them again. Then Elias accepted the card with the same calm expression he had carried all night. No excitement, no grief, just kindness steady enough not to make the moment feel transactional. Somehow, that made Claire trust him even more. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight and the smell of burnt toast drifting through a small apartment in Brooklyn. Elias stood at the stove in gray sweatpants, flipping pancakes one-handed, while Isaiah sat at the kitchen table coloring flames onto a cardboard rocket ship with intense concentration. The apartment was modest. Narrow hallway, scuffed floors, radiator knocking like an old drummer somewhere near the window. But it carried warmth in all the places expensive homes often forgot. Family photos on the refrigerator. A secondhand bookshelf leaning slightly left. A tiny pair of sneakers abandoned near the couch. "Dad," Isaiah said seriously without looking up from the markers, "do astronauts get lonely in space?" Elias glanced over with a faint smile. Probably sometimes. Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. I think everybody does. The statement landed heavier than an 8-year-old intended. Elias turned back toward the stove quietly after that. His phone buzzed against the kitchen counter a few minutes later. Unknown number. Elias almost ignored it until another message followed immediately beneath. Claire Whitmore. Good morning. I hope your son's science fair goes well today. He stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary. Not because the message itself surprised him, because she remembered. Again, who is Claire? Isaiah asked instantly, because children possess the supernatural ability to overhear absolutely everything. Elias slid the phone face down beside the coffee mug. Somebody from work. Isaiah narrowed his eyes suspiciously. That means grown-up mystery. Elias laughed softly under his breath. Eat your pancakes, man. By 10:30, that morning the elementary school gymnasium buzzed with folding chairs, poster boards, and exhausted parents carrying paper coffee cups. Children darted between displays wearing name tags and excitement like electricity. Elias adjusted the crooked collar of Isaiah's plaid shirt while the boy carefully positioned his cardboard rocket beside a handwritten sign that read how fuel creates thrust. Do not touch anything until the judges come, Elias reminded him gently. I know. Isaiah sighed dramatically. I am 8, not 5. Elias smiled to himself and stepped back, arms folded loosely across his chest. Then movement near the gym entrance caught his attention. A woman in a cream-colored coat stood just inside the doorway, slightly uncertain beneath the fluorescent lights and noise. Claire. She looked strangely out of place among the folding tables and construction paper volcanoes. Too elegant for the setting. Too tired for the elegance to matter. Elias blinked in surprise as she approached slowly through the crowd. You came, he said before thinking about it. Claire tucked a strand of loose hair behind one ear. I had a meeting downtown. The excuse arrived too quickly to be believable. Elias noticed. So did she, right? He said gently, pretending to accept it anyway. Isaiah looked up from his rocket display with open curiosity. Who is she? Claire hesitated for half a second before offering a small smile. I am Claire. The boy studied her carefully the way children studied adults when deciding whether they were trustworthy. You are the lady from my dad's phone. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Isaiah. What? The boy asked innocently. Claire surprised herself by laughing. Real laughter again. Loud enough this time that nearby parents glanced over. Isaiah grinned proudly like he had accomplished something important. Then his eyes narrowed thoughtfully at Claire's expression. Oh, he said softly. You are my dad's sad friend. The gymnasium noise seemed to fade for one strange, suspended second. Claire looked at the child standing beside the cardboard rocket and felt something warm crack gently through the loneliness she had carried for so long. Not because the boy pitied her, because he noticed her, honestly, without status or fear or calculation attached to it. Elias rubbed one hand against the back of his neck, while Isaiah continued coloring flames onto the rocket, completely unaware of the silence he had just changed. Claire looked toward Elias then. He smiled faintly, almost apologetically. He says exactly what he thinks. Claire nodded slowly while her eyes softened in a way they had not in months. Maybe that is why he feels honest. Across the crowded school gym filled with paper planets and tired parents,